Some stories are just moments, and then there are the ones that change everything. It begins with a single look, eyes that don't just glance, but see, that moment when the world slows, when something inside wakes up after being silent for too long. Then comes the pull, not rushed or reckless, but so certain it feels written in the stars, and when it happens, skin to skin, breath to breathe, every kiss becomes a vow. The night turns into something that can't be contained by hours, a lifetime pressed into the space between dusk and dawn. And even when the sun rises, the warmth doesn't fade. The body remembers, the soul remembers, because it was never just a night. It was a beginning. Welcome to a place where love isn't just told. It's felt, lived, and never forgotten. It happened in the smallest moment, in the most ordinary way, yet it altered everything. There was no dramatic entrance, no thunder in the sky, just a pair of eyes that found their way and refused to let go. They didn't skim over like most do, hurried and distracted. They stopped, they lingered. It wasn't a stare meant to intimidate or claim. It was the kind that saw, really saw. It slipped past the surface and into a place that had been quiet for too long, as if some closed room inside had been suddenly unlocked without warning. There was no smile at first, no rush to speak, only that silent exchange where the air thickens, where every other sound seems to fall away. In that gaze there was recognition, not the kind from memory, but the kind that feels like memory, as though some part of the soul was meeting what it had been looking for without knowing it. It was unsettling in the gentlest way, as if something deep had been sleeping for years and was suddenly pulled awake. Every detail of that moment etched itself sharply. The faint reflection of light in those eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening at the corners, the way they seemed to hold an unasked question and an unspoken answer at the same time. It wasn't just attraction. Attraction burns fast, flares, and fades. This was slower, heavier, more patient. It was as if there was an understanding that whatever this was, it wouldn't need to be chased. It would arrive, steady and certain, because it had been there all along. The space between seemed smaller than it truly was. People moved around, voices rose and fell, footsteps passed, but there was a strange stillness, a kind of quiet belonging, as if the noise of the world had lowered its volume out of respect. That gaze didn't demand, didn't push, it invited, and that was what made it dangerous. An invitation is far harder to resist than a demand. Time became something fragile, something to be careful with. Seconds felt stretched, suspended in that delicate thread between strangers and something else entirely. Every nerve was alive, but not in the way of fear. This was awareness, sharp and alert, the body's way of saying this matters. That it will matter for a long time. It wasn't about beauty, not in the shallow sense. Beauty can be admired without touching the heart. This was different. This was the way those eyes didn't look through or around, but into. The way they seemed to read what had been left unread, to notice the lines between the lines, to linger where others had passed by. And something shifted in that instant. A barrier that had been built slowly, brick by brick, over years of being unseen, unchosen, unnoticed. It loosened almost without permission. There was no reason to feel this exposed, not yet, but there it was. And it didn't feel unsafe. That was the strangest part. That look carried a warmth that was almost dangerous in its gentleness. It didn't ask to be let in. It made the walls themselves want to lower. There was something steady in it, something that promised there was no need to hide, and maybe that was why it sank so deeply, why it could awaken parts thought to be beyond reach. It's remarkable, the way the body remembers these things. The exact point where a heartbeat seemed to trip, the exact pull in the chest that said, "Stay here." The way air seemed to taste different, sharper, sweeter, as if every sense had been sharpened in an instant. Nothing else was said in that first moment, but a conversation had already begun, one without words, carried entirely in the silent language of the eyes, and in that unspoken conversation, An entire truth was passed between two people who had not yet touched. A truth that would not disappear when the night ended, because it had never belonged to the night to begin with. Some moments don't need to be long to change everything. They only need to be real. It began like a slow tide, rising without sound, touching the edges before filling everything. There was no rush, no reckless grasp, no clumsy urgency, just a steady pull, so certain it felt less like choice and more like a truth waiting to happen. Some things arrive not because you chase them, but because they've been written somewhere beyond your reach, quietly, patiently, until the time is right. The space between was charged in a way that made every movement deliberate. A brush of the shoulder felt like it had been rehearsed in some other lifetime. A shift of the eyes carried the weight of a promise. It wasn't hunger in its raw, restless form. It was something deeper, heavier, a longing that had been there long before the first word was spoken. The kind that makes you believe two people can walk separate paths for years, only to meet at the exact moment they were meant to. Every glance was a step closer, every word a thread weaving tighter. It wasn't about filling silence, but creating it. Those pauses between sentences where breath became louder than sound, where the air thickened enough to feel like it could be touched. It was in those pauses that the truth lived, the unspoken knowing that this connection had already been decided somewhere else, long before either had arrived here. The way a hand reached, not abruptly, not searching, but finding exactly where it was meant to rest. It felt inevitable. As if skin had always been waiting for this warmth, as if every line in the palm had been drawn to match another's. Even the smallest gestures carried a strange familiarity, like the touch of a favorite song you've never heard before but somehow know by heart. There was no need to wonder what came next, no question of whether this was too much or too soon. It felt like slipping into a rhythm already in motion, a dance whose steps were known without ever being taught. Breath to breathe, each one closer, each one deeper, until the distance between was no longer measured in inches but in heartbeats, fingers traced without haste, eyes held without flinching. It wasn't a fire that devoured. It was a fire that claimed slowly, deliberately, the way the sun warms a cold room until every shadow softens. The world outside could have fallen away, and still it wouldn't have broken the thread that held the two together in that moment. The way lips met wasn't hurried, wasn't careless. It was as if time itself leaned in to witness, to slow, to make space for something rare. There was depth in it, a weight that said this was more than desire. It was recognition, union, the answering of a call neither had fully understood until now. And when the closeness deepened, when breath tangled with breath, it felt less like an act and more like the fulfillment of a story that had been unfolding long before either had been aware of it. Every movement was precise, not because it was calculated, but because it was natural. Nothing felt taken. Everything felt given. The body knew, the soul knew, and perhaps that was the most overwhelming truth, that what was happening wasn't a creation, but a return. Some things are not found. They find you. The night felt alive from the moment it began, carrying a weight in the air that could be tasted, not the kind of weight that drags things down, but the kind that presses gently, making every sound softer, every movement sharper, every glance heavier. There was no rush, no chaos, only an unspoken agreement that nothing beyond this moment mattered. The first touch was tentative, not from uncertainty, but from reverence. Skin against skin carried more than heat. It carried meaning, the quiet acknowledgement that this was not just about the body. Every brush of fingertips felt like it was carving a memory into something deeper, something that would not fade with daylight. Each breath carried the other's name without needing to be spoken. Kisses began slowly, as if they were mapping the shape of something unseen, as if each one needed to be memorized before the next could happen. They didn't just land, they lingered, soaking into the space where passion met tenderness. Every kiss was both a question and an answer, both a beginning and a continuation. It was impossible to tell where one ended and the next began, because they weren't separate. They were a single, unbroken thread. The night moved forward in waves. Sometimes the pull was fierce, urgent, as if the universe itself might collapse if the two didn't close every fraction of space between them. Other times it slowed, deepened, and became so gentle that the smallest sigh felt like the loudest sound in the room. Passion and tenderness wove through each other seamlessly. There was no distinction anymore. The fire didn't consume. It warmed and illuminated. Hands traced familiar places as if they were brand new, pausing as though there was something sacred in each discovery. Every movement was met with an answering movement, as if the bodies had known this choreography long before the night began. Breath mingled in the space between, not rushed, but steady, in rhythm with the beating of hearts that seemed determined to match each other. There was a point where the night felt too small to hold it all, as if the walls could not contain the way time stretched and folded in on itself, as if hours were both endless and fleeting. Every glance, every touch, every kiss deepened the truth that this was not something that could be measured in time at all. It was not a night. It was a lifetime condensed into the space between dusk and dawn. The closeness went beyond the physical, slipping into something that felt like it had no edges, no borders. It was as if two selves had been poured into the same vessel, impossible to separate again. And in that closeness there was a kind of vow, spoken but undeniable, the kind of vow that doesn't need to be promised in words because it's already written into the way hands hold on, into the way eyes meet without hesitation, into the way the body stays even when the moment could have ended. When the darkness began to soften into the first light of morning, it didn't feel like an ending. The warmth still clung to the air, the heartbeat of the night still echoed beneath the skin. Nothing had been lost to the passing of hours. Instead, something had been claimed. Some nights are simply nights, but others, they become the kind of memory that doesn't live in the mind alone. They live in the body, in the breath, in the places where two people once held each other and knew they belonged there. And this one would never be forgotten. Morning came quietly, the kind of light that slips in slowly, touching the edges before filling the room. The night's intensity should have faded by then. Most nights do. But there was something different in the air, something that hadn't burned out with the darkness. The warmth was still there, not the fleeting heat of passion that cools with time, but something steady, deep, and alive. The body still carried the memory of every touch, every kiss, as though the skin itself had been changed. There was no forgetting the way breath had mingled in the dark, the way hearts had found a rhythm together. It was in the smallest things, the way fingertips now felt empty without that connection, the way the chest tightened in the best possible way at the thought of it. The fire of the night had not consumed and vanished. It had built something that continued to burn quietly, like embers that refused to die. The soul remembered even more vividly. The way the world outside had ceased to exist, the way the closeness had felt like more than a moment, more than a night. It wasn't about the hours spent. It was about the way something inside had shifted permanently. This wasn't an escape into passion. It was an arrival into something that felt like it had been waiting all along. Even the silence after spoke volumes. No words were needed to explain what had happened, because nothing about it was unclear. Every glance, every faint smile carried the same truth. This was not over. This was not a memory to be tucked away, but a beginning that would be carried forward. There was a comfort in knowing that the connection was not tied to a single night's fire. It wasn't fragile. It wasn't something that would fade in the light. It was strong enough to survive the quiet moments, the pauses, the space between. It had depth, the kind of depth that can hold both passion and stillness, both desire and calm. The hours that followed were different, but no less full. The touch of a hand was just as electric as it had been in the dark. The closeness was softer, but no less real. The warmth wasn't in the urgency anymore. It was in the constancy. That's when it became clear. What had been shared wasn't just an intense night, but a turning point. It's rare for something to linger this way. Most fires either burn out or consume everything around them. But this settled in the heart like it had always belonged there. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed, quietly undeniable, and even as the day moved forward, as the world returned to its noise and demands, that feeling stayed. Some beginnings are loud and obvious. Others slip in quietly, disguised as moments that seem small until you realize they've changed the course of everything. This was one of those beginnings, and it would stay, no matter how much time passed. Because once the soul recognizes where it belongs, it never forgets. If this story touched something deep inside you, let it stay there. And if you want more moments that feel like this, raw, real, unforgettable, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because here, every story is a heartbeat you can feel.